Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. In today's insanely fast-moving news cycle, foreign policy and our domestic realities are colliding faster than they ever have before. We are looking at a deeply interconnected situation right now, where military decisions made thousands of miles away are literally instantly impacting American wallets, our energy markets, and overall geopolitical stability. It's a prime example of how overnight actions overseas create massive, immediate ripples right here at home in the U.S.
So to make sense of all this, here is our agenda. First, the US-Iran drone strikes. 2, the clashes between Israel and Hezbollah. 3, the domestic economic impacts. 4, the strategic political stance. And finally, number 5, the actual US military footprint.
Starting off with Section 1, the US-Iran drone strikes. We're looking at a fragile ceasefire and a really tense tit-for-tat escalation.
Right, so we have to start at the absolute epicenter of the conflict, where a very fragile ceasefire between the US and Iran is hanging by a thread. This escalation happened incredibly fast, literally overnight. It kicked off with Iran launching a drone at a vessel approaching the Strait of Hormuz. Well, because this posed an immediate, undeniable threat to navigation, it was struck down. The U.S. then immediately retaliated by targeting a control station near Bandar Abbas that was prepping to launch yet another drone into the airspace, and then, almost immediately in response to that, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a drone and missile attack targeting a base in Kuwait. It is a classic, deeply dangerous tit-for-tat cycle playing out in the dark over just a handful of hours.
Now, despite these kinetic strikes, diplomacy hasn't been completely abandoned. But the parameters, they are incredibly rigid right now. The U.S. administration has set a strict standard for any kind of nuclear agreement, and they are explicitly refusing to accept any deal that allows for exporting uranium to China and Russia. They're demanding what they call a great deal and are totally willing to walk away or even escalate to just finish the job, as the source puts it, if those uncompromising conditions aren't met. It's basically a high-stakes staring contest where absolutely neither side wants to give an inch.
Moving to Section 2, Israel and Hezbollah clashes. Regional instability spreading north.
This tension isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's actively igniting fronts across the entire Middle East, and the humanitarian reality of these proxy clashes is just severe. As heavy IDF strikes move into Lebanon following evacuation orders, the civilian toll is really mounting. A recent strike hit a building containing 6 apartments in southern Lebanon. These were occupied by impoverished families who had already been displaced, literally fleeing earlier violence, only to be caught up in the crossfire all over again. Tragically, this resulted in at least 8 people killed.
And the warfare technology on the ground? It is evolving at a terrifying speed. Hezbollah is currently deploying advanced fiber-optic drones against Israel. Now, because of how these things are physically wired and controlled, traditional electronic jamming and interception methods are completely failing. These drones are getting right through the current defenses, which is forcing tech teams to frantically scramble for countermeasures. It fundamentally changes the tactical reality on the ground when standard defense domes are just bypassed entirely.
All right, Section 3, Domestic Economic Impacts. This is all about the financial ripple effect back at home. So while all these advanced drones fly overseas, the shockwaves are immediately crashing into the American economy, directly hitting our domestic energy markets. Now, you might expect a massive conflict in the Middle East to permanently send gas prices to the moon, right? But the immediate reaction was actually the exact opposite. Contrary to all those widespread fears of a sustained surge, major oil benchmarks like WTI and Brent crude actually dropped by more than $4 overnight. They fell roughly $5 per barrel below their recent peak.
So why did that happen? Well, the White House argues this surprising resilience is the direct result of a domestic energy dominance agenda. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has actually called the recent oil price surges transitory. The United States is currently selling more energy to the rest of the world than ever before. This heavy domestic production output running right alongside dropping natural gas and pharmaceutical prices is acting as a massive buffer. It's actively shielding the American consumer from the absolute worst of these global shockwaves.
To put that into perspective, we saw inflation sitting at a very manageable 2.5%. Then it spiked up to 3.8% directly amid the conflict. But the good news is it's expected to stabilize around 3.3%. Economists are attributing these inflation shifts almost entirely to energy volatility. Basically, if it weren't for the oil and gas reactions to this specific geopolitical tension, broader economic growth would be even higher. The underlying U.S. economy continues to grow at a really steady 2%, but energy, it remains the unpredictable wild card that's dictating the immediate future of domestic inflation.
Okay, on to Section 4. The strategic political stance, holding the line in the Middle East.
Navigating this incredibly interconnected landscape requires a very specific, very hard-line posture.
The administration's current strategy is rooted in a clear psychological reading of their adversary. Basically, they believe Iran knows it cannot defeat the United States militarily in a conventional head-to-head fight. Therefore, their entire geopolitical strategy hinges on outlasting the U.S., provoking a retreat, and simply waiting for American leadership to blink. And the source reporting suggests that if the U.S. were to actually back down, the direct result would be gradual refunding for proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
And retreating carries massive long-term costs. It means Hezbollah and Hamas get their funding fully restored. It ensures prolonged systemic unrest across the Arab world. And crucially, it accelerates the timeline for an Iranian nuclear weapon. The administration actually sees this as a direct parallel to Saddam Hussein lying about his weapons capabilities between 1991 and 1993. The underlying philosophy here is that failing to hold the line right now doesn't actually solve the problem. It just hands a massively magnified threat to the next generation.
Let's look at Section 5, U.S. military footprint. We really need to separate fact from fiction here.
In the fog of war, disinformation spreads just as fast as the drones do. There is a direct contradiction currently playing out in international media. Iranian state-run television is aggressively pushing a narrative that the U.S. is actively withdrawing forces from the region and attempting to restore commercial shipping, all while letting Iran manage the traffic. The U.S. response to these reports? Absolutely blunt. The U.S. president called it a complete fabrication. The reality on the ground tells a very, very different story.
So instead of a quiet withdrawal, the reality is a massive, deeply entrenched U.S. military presence that is actively enforcing blockades. We're talking about 15,000 troops actively enforcing the blockade against Iran right now. Thousands more are stationed at robust bases across the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. And that completely excludes the multiple naval vessels packed with thousands of sailors and Marines operating in the surrounding waters. Make no mistake, the United States is heavily deployed, highly visible, and actively holding its ground.
And this strict no-nonsense posture extends to regional partners as well. Oman recently indicated they were exploring a formal partnership with Tehran, while the U.S. response was uncompromising and severe, unequivocally threatening military strikes against Oman if they move forward with that alliance. It is a very hardline approach, specifically designed to completely isolate the adversary and ensure that the blockade remains an impenetrable wall.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really crucial question about the future of this fragile, deeply interconnected landscape. We've seen how fiber-optic drones, hardline diplomacy, and shifting domestic oil prices here in the U.S. are all tied together in this incredibly dangerous knot. Will the current strategy of holding the line successfully force a diplomatic resolution? Or are the tit-for-tat strikes we saw overnight just the opening moves of a much larger regional conflict? Keep a close eye on those energy markets and that ongoing tech race, because the global ripple effects, they are already right at our doorstep.